Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. Thanks for joining us. Hi, everyone. We're going to give everybody another minute or so to join, and then we're going to get started. Thanks for joining. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. We're going to get started now. Thank you all for being here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nicole Taylor here, the President and CEO of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to use the Q&A function to submit your questions at any time during the program. We'll try to work them in as they come in, but we have dedicated time at the end for questions in the Q&A. Please, when you submit your questions, if it's for one of our two guests in particular, to specify which guest you'd like to answer, or if you just like it open and anyone, either one of them or any of the three of us to answer, that's fine as well. So thank you today for joining us on a really important conversation on race and bias. We're in the middle of a moment in history, a moment of national outcry over racial injustice and the oppressive nature of the very systems that make up our society. Since our founding, Silicon Valley Community Foundation has always sought to address racial and economic disparities in our community. We've approached our community impact and public policy work through a lens of equity. In the past, for example, we've produced and invested in issue-focused reports that exposed, for one, how Black and Latinx people were disproportionately affected by predatory payday lending. We also sponsored the California Mathematics Placement Act of 2015, a bill that addressed issues of math misplacement where students of color were unfairly held back in 9th grade math classes. That bill was later signed into law. We've made strategic investments along the way in programs to ensure the safety and security of undocumented immigrants and to help them access economic opportunities in our communities. And we've recently wrapped up a year-long strategic planning process, which resulted in us strengthening our resolve to pursue deep structural changes that will reduce systemic disparities and injustices. Most recently, our COVID-19 response work is focused on supporting low-income families, communities of color, and undocumented immigrants, groups that have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And as of today, Since January, thanks to the generosity of our donors, we have distributed $177 million in grants to support those most in need through the COVID-19 crisis. And immediately following the social unrest incited by the murder of George Floyd, our organization sprung into action again. We provided our communities with information, education, and referrals to organizations working on achieving social justice. We stood up a racial equity and social justice webpage to become a hub of anti-racism resources and for everyone to access. And I am launching, with the help of incredible staff here at the foundation, a President's Community Advisory Council, where we will engage community leaders of color to help ensure that we continue to implement strategies and advocate for policies using a race and equity lens. I want to hear from the very voices of the folks we care most about and bring those voices into the rooms where decisions are made. Together with the American Leadership Forum of Silicon Valley, we spearheaded the creation of a pledge calling for local funders to recenter their focus on low-income residents and communities of color. There's so much more work that needs to be done. We know that if we are not actively and intentionally seeking out solutions, then we are complicit in the problems. I believe that what we are seeing and living through today isn't just a fleeting moment in history, but a significant turning point. I have to believe that, actually, where we all have the opportunity to scrutinize, dismantle, and then rebuild our systems to be better for everyone. Part of this experience means taking the time to listen, reflect, and think critically. The Community Foundation is proud to host conversations where together with our donors, our community partners, our funding partners, we examine what does systemic justice truly mean? And what can each of us do, each of us, to facilitate real fundamental change that will result in a more just world? Last week, I facilitated a conversation with the leaders of NPR and KQED where we discussed how the systems of journalism, news, and information can be more inclusive and accessible to all members of our communities. And today, I'm so pleased to welcome our guests, two esteemed leaders in the field of racial justice. They join us for a timely and important discussion on the effects of bias and race on our society and what we can each do to seize on the moment we are experiencing right now and effect change. So with that, please join me in first welcoming Jennifer Eberhardt, the Morris M. Doyle Centennial Professor of Public Policy and a Professor of Psychology at Stanford University. She is the author of the highly acclaimed and sold out book on Amazon, which is fantastic, Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. It is considered a must read for understanding the roots of racial injustice and the problem of our country's criminal justice system. And second, I'd like to welcome Ralph Richard Banks, or as we know him, Rick, the Jackson Eli Reynolds Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, and by courtesy, a professor at Stanford School of Education. He is the author of Is Marriage for White People? How the African-American Marriage Decline Affects Everyone, and a forthcoming book, The Miseducation of America, How Our Leading Universities Undermine Democracy, Reinforce Racism, and Fail Students. Rick is also in the process of founding the Center for Racial Justice at Stanford Law School, the first initiative of its kind at the university, and we'll get into that further into our discussion. Jennifer and Rick, welcome, and thank you for joining us here today. All right, let's make sure that they are on screen. All right, there we go. Hello, Jennifer.
Hey.
Good to see you.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's make sure we can Rick as well. Excellent. Here we go. So I've known you both for quite a while. Small world that we've all come up in, the world known as the Stanford Connection. But I want our audience to know a little bit more about both of you. First, how did you come together? Because you both are married with 3 wonderful boys. How did you first get connected? How did you meet each other. And I mean, you're both in research and writing on race and racism. So where did it start?
Well, it didn't start there. It actually, we met in elementary school, actually.
No. I
Yeah,
actually
up in Cleveland, Ohio.
Wow.
Yeah, so we didn't hang out much then because Rick was in what they called special major work. It was like a fancy term for the gifted class, and I was in the class with the normal kids. So, so that's how we first met. And then we parted ways because my family moved to a different area of Cleveland, and Rick went to a different school. And we re-met when we were at Harvard. Rick was in law school and I was a graduate student there. And he recognized my face from back in elementary school. So
nice.
By the time I was in law school, I had changed, but Jennifer had not. So I just remembered her as the girl from the regular class who had tried to steal money and terrorize us on the playground. Believe it or not.
I did do that. I was bad back then. I had to be to survive.
Yes, yes. Well, to survive with somebody like Rick. Okay, now we're getting too personal. So how did you both find your way to researching and writing about race and racism? Because you took two different academic paths. You know, Rick, you ended up in law school, and Jennifer, you're in psychology and public policy. How did that come about? Because that's two different paths.
Yeah, for me. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to start?
No, I was just going to say, I think that to go back to Cleveland, I mean, we both grew up in Cleveland, and we went to an elementary school in the inner city of Cleveland, and then went to middle schools and high schools that were very different. I went to a private all-boys school that was far out in the suburbs, a suburb that I hadn't even been to before, frankly. This is the school where the children of the titans of Cleveland during the industrial age went. It was an all-boys school. And that was a kind of a turning point in my life, because I went from a literally 100% African-American environment to a predominantly white and extremely wealthy environment. And even as a child, I began to wonder about the different neighborhoods and the different opportunities, the different resources, and to try to make sense of this great divide that I saw in my own city.
Yeah. And so
yeah,
Jennifer,
similar experience there, all Black world. My parents announced that we were going to move to this suburb called Beechwood when I was 12 years old. And I didn't know much about Beechwood, but I knew that there were no Black people who lived there. I was a little bit nervous, about moving. And we moved out, I was worried about making friends and all that, but, people were nice and welcoming. But like Rick, the big thing that I noticed was just the stark difference in terms of resources. And so that got me thinking a lot about race and inequality, even at that age. These neighborhoods were just a bike ride away, but it was like a world of difference, not just in terms of resources, but also in terms of the expectations. So all of the teachers at this new school, they were prepping us for the next stage, which was college. It wasn't something that was, a step for the only people who were, at the very top. But the expectation was that all of us would go to college. And so just the sense of our potential and everything was completely different. And it seemed to be very much aligned by race.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I should just to add finally that both of our families were refugees from the South.
Oh yeah, the Great Migration.
Right. And the Great Migration, though, frankly, makes it almost sound a little more innocuous than it is. I mean, they were refugees from a situation of terrorism.
Yeah. Say more about that. Say more about that. Say more about that, because I mean,
yes.
I know we joke about it because we know, but there could be people listening who actually don't understand the pattern of what happened with folks fleeing.
Right. Well, I'll just say, so my father's family, my father came north when he was a child. And what prompted his family to move was that his oldest brother did what it turned out was could have been a error that cost him his life, which is that he wore a new suit into town and was confronted by white boys in town who recognized him in the new suit and took that as an affront to the racial hierarchy that prevailed in Georgia. So he wore a new suit into town, fight erupted. And my father's memory is of carrying the gun shells that his brother needed as he ran with the shotgun to defend the family from the crowd the mob that had come back to their house. Before the sun rose the next morning, they were on the train to Cleveland.
Wow.
And they never, as it turned out, went back to Georgia. And this was a story that my father, who's deceased now, he only revealed to us bit by bit.
Right.
Something he dwelled on, wasn't something he talked about. But for me, it became kind of a stand-in for what life was like as a Black family in Georgia in the early 20th century.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Folks don't realize that, you know, when Black folks moved out of the South, these were very real terrorist kind of situations, right?
Yes.
Almost.
Yes. And so there was, right. So there, I mean, there was a lure of good jobs, and there was an allure to places like Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit, but there was also a terroristic aspect to living in the South, and all things that we would take for granted as being part of freedom actually wasn't a part of their life.
Right.
So
Right.
that was, and yes, my only other piece of family history I'll share is that on my mother's side, her father was the child of a mixed race couple. And in Southern Alabama, this was actually the late 19th century, that was so unaccepted that he had to be smuggled out of town in a shoebox. And his father, who's African-American, had to leave town and was never heard from again because both of them would have certainly been killed otherwise.
Right. Yeah.
So, you know, these are kind of stories that we grew up with.
Right. Well, you know, and I think when I think about those stories, I think about our boys. You know, we all have boys. And unfortunately, we haven't come far enough. You know, my son, we've talked about, my son is 20 years old. He's a rugby player. And when the Ahmaud Arbery incident happened, when he was, you know, basically followed and gunned down in broad daylight for running through a neighborhood in Georgia, my son, when it finally came out that happened months later, my son has not run since. That fear is real. He has not run, he stepped out of our house to go on a run, and he used to do that every day. And I talked to friends of mine, our peer group, men, who the same thing. They haven't run since. They haven't run since because that fear is real, and it's a terror that we feel. Because I'm not encouraging him to go for a run.
Yes.
You know, and that's here in progressive California, right? The Bay Area, and he won't do it, and I'm glad he's not doing it. So we still got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Which leads to the work that you all do every day. So I'd love to start with Jennifer. In your book, Biased, you intertwine research with lots of stories, which really brings the research to life. So can you give us an example, a real poignant example of racial bias in action?
Well, I start the book with a story about one of my sons. And at the time, he was just about 5 years old, and we were on an airplane together. And my son was just so excited, you know, about being on this airplane with mommy, and he's looking all around and he's checking people out, and he sees this man and he says, "Hey, that guy looks like daddy." And I look at the guy and he doesn't look anything at all like Rick, like nothing at all. And so then I start to look around on the plane, and I realized that this man was the only Black man on the plane. And I thought, okay, you know, I'm going to have a little talk with my son about how not all Black people look alike. Right. So I'm getting ready to have the talk, and then I pause and I think, well, maybe there is some resemblance that my son can see that I can't. Like, he hasn't been conditioned year after year to see things in certain ways. And so I decided I was going to give it a shot and look at this guy for any resemblance. And I look at his height and his weight, no resemblance. I look at his facial features, nothing, skin color, nothing. And then I look at his hair, and this guy has a long dreadlocks flowing down his back. And Rick shaves his head. And back then he shaved his head.
He really did not look like Rick.
Not at all. And so I'm thinking, okay, you're going to get the talk, right? And so before I can say anything, he looks up at me and he says, I hope he doesn't rob the plane. And I said, what? What did you say? And he says it again. He says, well, I hope that man doesn't rob the plane. And I said, well, why would you say that? You know, Daddy wouldn't rob a plane. And he says, yeah, I know that. And I said, well, why would you say that? And he looked at me with this really sad face. And he says, I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that. So we're living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next. This association between Blackness and crime made its way, into his mind at 5 years old.
Jeez. Rick, how did that make you feel?
Well, it was sad, and it was sobering, and it remains so. I should add, though, that when Jennifer first told me this story, she was a bit amused that the guy that Everett confused with me had long flowing dreadlocks, and she described me as bald. In fact, I'm glad she recognized it, that I merely shaved my head. So that's important to know. But it does highlight a unfortunate reality. I mean, this is there are worries that our parents had with us when we were children, and dynamics in society that they recognized. And you would have thought that we would be over that, decades later.
Yeah.
Now here we are, even as you referenced, Nicole, kind of struggling with some of the same issues for our children. So
Right. Jennifer, what are some findings from your research that have made the biggest impression on you?
Well, there are lots of findings in the criminal justice space. So, for example, like in laboratory studies, we found that, after simply exposing people to Black faces on a computer screen, they can see blurry images of guns with greater speed and greater clarity. So it's almost as though this association between Blackness and crime can influence, how we see and what we see. We've had other studies where we've prompted people to think about violent crime, and then we find that that leads them to look towards Black faces and away from white faces. And we've shown the same thing with police officers. So prompting them to think of shooting or arresting or capturing, leads their eyes to settle on Black faces and move away, from white faces.
Right.
And then we've also looked at this in the courtroom. So in a large data set of death eligible defendants, we found that looking more Black more than doubles the chances that those defendants will receive a death sentence, at least when their victims are white. And we found that no matter what we control for, the aggravators and the mitigators, the severity of the crime, and no matter what we control for, we found that Black defendants appear to be punished in proportion to the Blackness of their physical features. So the more Black, the more death worthy they were.
Wow. So, that speaks to the whole issue of implicit bias, right?
It does.
And I know for decades, implicit bias trainings have been used by organizations, by companies across the country to try to eliminate racial bias. Do these efforts have any meaningful effect on institutions like police departments?
The simple answer is we don't know. So, there's been decades of research on racial bias, and we know that we're all susceptible to bias, even when we, are not aware of it, and even when we don't intend, to be biased. And we
like your son on the airplane.
Yeah, exactly. So we've known that for a while, but we know much less about the actual trainings that are out there, that people are offering to mitigate bias. And so, they haven't been evaluated. I think in the policing world, oftentimes community members will push police departments to, to have these trainings because they feel like it's going to make, a big difference, in terms of how they're treated on the street or in terms of just policing. But they have the trainings and they don't even, for the most part, actually examine that. And what they do, to the extent that they do, evaluate the training, it's, did you like the training, right? It's not the kind of metric that I think most of us would have in mind for, what you really want to see. So that's a real problem.
It is. So then what, you mean, at first I was thinking, well, something's better than nothing, but
not always.
Right? Not always. So,
not always. Like that could be worse in some instances. It's because if it's not making a difference, and then corporations or police departments are using that to say that they put in the effort here, they've checked the box here, then it could make it less likely that they'll actually do the things that they need to do to make real change, like changing policies and practices and so forth.
Right.
I don't want to bash all the trainings because there are lots of different types of trainings. The issue is that we don't know, and we deserve to know. And so to the extent that they're out there, I think they should be evaluated so we can improve them, if they're not working, or get rid of them if they're not working.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with Jennifer that.
Go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I just wanted to second what Jennifer says, that one of the key take homes is that a lot of times people have intuitions about what to do, and sometimes those intuitions are correct and sometimes they're not. And the way to figure out what's best to do is actually have it be grounded in research.
Yeah.
Research and evaluation to get information and to think rigorously about it, rather than just, assume that something seems the right thing to do and so it's going to work out.
Right. Well, gosh, there's so many places that we can go with that, because I was thinking about the AI work, which I want to get to, that Jennifer's about to do, because I think that actually speaks to exactly what are the kinds of things we should be doing. So if both of you are less optimistic of just saying, do bias training, because, what should we be doing, particularly when it comes to the criminal justice system? And maybe we start, Jennifer, with your AI work, and then Rick, what else that you're seeing in your scholarship about what optimistic things, what optimism do you have about what is working?
Yeah, so across the country, police officers are required to wear body-worn cameras. And I think if you look at the largest police departments in the country, at least 80% of them or more actually have these cameras. And for the most part, when the departments introduce the cameras, that's associated with a drop in use of force and a drop in citizen complaints. And so that's a good thing. But I feel like we haven't even begun to really, leverage those cameras enough, because the fact is that the vast majority of the footage that comes from those cameras is never examined. So individual officers, would you say?
Right. Unless somebody pulls out their phone and records an officer doing something, then they demand to see the footage, right?
Right. So it happens in these isolated cases, and in extreme cases, they can fish out the footage and look at it, and we can sort of adjudicate right and wrong. And so, but that's using the footage as evidence. And so what we are trying to do is use the footage as data. And so we want to look across lots and lots of police, interactions with the public to try to understand what's going on. And so that's what we've done, at Stanford. So with an interdisciplinary group, we've begun to use these machine learning techniques to comb through camera footage. And in an initial study, we looked at nearly 1,000 traffic stops here in the Bay Area, in Oakland, in their police department. And we found that even when police officers were behaving professionally, right? And sort of nothing happened. There was no, major incident, no use of force or anything, no arrest even. We found that they spoke to Black drivers with less respect than white drivers. And wow. we could even actually use the words that officers used alone to, predict whether they were talking to a Black driver or a white driver.
And the tone of their voice, right? You could
And
even
the tone of their voice. That's right. So we did a study where we would kind of muffle the words. And so it sounds like, you know, somebody speaking, you know, and the door is closed and you can kind of hear their tone, but you can't, you know, hear the actual words. It's called content filtering. And so we did that, and we just had people listen to the tones, and it was the same thing. The tones directed at Black drivers were seen as less respectful. You know, those tones were seen as sort of officers talking down to whomever they were talking to. Again, with all of this, the you know, the study participants here are blind, you know, to the race of the driver, and so that doesn't really, you know, explain anything. We're just focused on the words or the tones of the officers, and we can, you know, predict a lot and understand a lot just from that.
right.
Yeah.
So for either of you, and there's a question here to follow on that, is there a positive example of data-driven training, be it biased or otherwise, for law enforcement that we could capitalize on and should be seen as something that can be replicated or proliferated throughout the country? I mean, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I would like the footage to be used as training. And in fact, we actually did a training in Oakland after we, you know, released a, you know, a report or, you know, empirical article on this. And so, you know, community members there actually wanted the department to respond in some way. And so the department came to us as researchers to try to help them to, you know, create a training around the traffic stop. And so we did that. And we, in that training, we described our findings and all of that. We had takeaways, you know, for them. And now, you know, we're going to look at the body-worn camera footage from those officers before the training, and then again, 4 weeks after the training, to see if that training made a difference. And so here you could, you know, contrast this right with the implicit bias training, because we're actually looking at real interactions on the street, and we are looking at whether the training actually adjusted those interactions in a positive way. And so that's, for us, is a gold standard. It's not how you feel or how you feel about the training. It's like, what are you doing on the street that is different, that is actually improving police community relations.
Right. Anything to add there, Rick? Or I was actually
I would just add to just a bit, because I think Jennifer even understates the great promise of the, she's not one to promote it or be self-promoting, but the automated review of the body cam footage is a game changer, because there are, you know, untold hours of footage being collected, and it just sits on the web. It's never looked at, and to be able, and the only way to possibly review it is to have an automated process. And Jennifer's team is working to develop that. And that could enable departments across the country to actually improve their training. It creates possibilities for accountability, so many potential benefits there. And the reason it hasn't happened, frankly, is not because departments don't want to do it or people don't want to do it, but because they don't have the know-how to do it. And that's what Stanford can do, of course, is to bring in the intellectual resources and research capabilities that can help organizations to do what they might want to do but don't know how to do.
Right.
Right. Right.
You even take the case of consent searches. Like, you know, there's a rule in Oakland, you know, policy that you have to let people know when you want to conduct a consent search that they can refuse that search. But how do you know if officers actually let them know that, right? And so one way you could look at that as a check is to look at the footage to see if they are actually following policy on the street. And so, I mean, there are 1,001, you know, different applications here that I think, you know, Rick is right in terms of accountability. If you want to use the camera as an accountability tool, you actually have to look at the footage, you know, that camera produces.
Right. Well, there's one other thing I want to talk about in terms of practice, and then I want to get to a historical context, because Rick, I've heard you speak about this historical context for the moment we're in. So I'll get to that in a moment. The last piece in terms of practice, though, is the idea of friction, Jennifer, and what you did with Oakland PD and introducing friction and what that actually meant in terms of the stops, the traffic stops that their police officers made in that city. And that was born out of work with the tech company here, right?
Yeah, it's true.
So I think that would be, for those who don't know the story, I think it's really critical, it involves Nextdoor, right? the app Nextdoor.
Right. Right. So yes, you want me to start with Nextdoor or Oakland?
Yeah, start with Nextdoor and then how you use that to work with the police department.
Yeah, so Nextdoor, most people know, what their purpose is right, to try to, create this online environment where neighbors could gather and share information and so forth. But they were finding that they had a problem with racial profiling on the platform. So they reached out to me and they reached out to other researchers to figure out how to curb profiling. And they realized that to curb profiling, they were going to have to slow people down. So that is, they were going to have to add friction, which we all know for a tech, company, that's the last thing they want to do, right? They want to, produce products that, without friction, that are easy to use, that are intuitive, where you don't even have to think. But it turns out those are the very conditions under which bias can come alive. And so they had a choice to make, and against their instincts, they chose to purposely add friction. And they did this with a simple checklist. So if you, clicked on the crime and safety tab because you saw a Black man, for example, in an otherwise white neighborhood, it wouldn't allow you to then shout out to all, the neighbors that this suspicious Black man was there. You would have to, on this checklist, say, you'd have to say, what is it about this person's behavior that's making him suspicious? It cannot be, simply, his race and gender and so forth. So they had this checklist with a few items on it, and this was their method of slowing people down. And what they were trying to do is to, that sign you've all seen in airports, if you see something, say something. So they were trying to modify that. So it's, if you see something, suspicious, say something specific. So that's what they were going for. And they found that slowing people down, adding this friction, actually reduced racial profiling by over 75%.
Right. Incredible. And then you did that with Oakland Police.
Similar kind of technique in Oakland. So, with a number of Stanford researchers, we work with the department to try to help them to reduce the number of stops they were making of people who were not committing any serious crime. And we did this, again, by slowing them down. And so what we did is we added a question to the form officers complete each and every time they make a stop. And that question was, is this stop intelligence-led? Yes or no? In other words, do I have prior evidence that would tie this specific person to a particular crime, right? And we found, so just doing that, it pushes you away from just using your intuition about who to stop, but it pushes you to, use evidence of, sort of credible evidence of wrongdoing. And so, we found that the stops dropped. Before that question was added, they had made about 32,000 stops across the city. With the addition of that question, in that following year, they made about 19,000 stops. So a huge drop. And then African-American stops alone fell by over 43%. Wow. So the finding, and this all happened while the crime rate continued to fall, right? So, this idea that, which they were worried about is that if we don't stop this many people and stop this many Black people, crime rate would shoot up, but it didn't. It continued to fall. And, actually stopping fewer, Black people, didn't make the city more dangerous. It actually made it more safe, right, for everyone. So that's we consider that a win, and it's about sort of changing their mindset in the moment. And so a lot of people think about bias as just something that's just attached to the person, like it's a stable thing and you're biased or you're not. But a lot of that bias is triggered by our, the situations that we're in. And so if you can intervene on the situation like we did, with the police officers, like Nextdoor did with users, then you have a real shot at interrupting it and actually creating a space that is more equitable.
Fantastic. So thank you. And thanks for your work on that. And I know Jennifer, as you can imagine, is getting tapped by police departments all over the country once they've heard about what she's been doing in this research. So that's hopeful, right? That we want that kind of change. So Rick, I want you to help provide us a little bit of context here. You've talked about the 3 eras of history, right? So there was a question that came in with an early registrant for the webinar. If we frame the overarching issue as white supremacy on one hand And then on the other hand, you have Black slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, structural racism. Are we finally at a moment in our history that calls for bold, drastic actions, right? Is this finally that time in history for us to make actions? And what's different about this time than the 60s, right? Or, you know,
Right.
what happened with the end of slavery, right? So can you just give us that context? Because I think it's really important for all of us to understand how we got to this point in time. I think many of us assume, especially those of us who might consider ourselves well-educated, that we think we know how we got here. But
Right.
the way you framed it in the past has been very eye-opening.
Well, let me start by, since Jennifer, so we do have 3 boys, and you know, before the killing of George Floyd, sometimes we would talk about the COVID situation and the pandemic, which is kind of a downer, of course, but you know, we would remind them that, you know, when you're old, your children, grandchildren will be coming to you to ask you about what it was like to live through the pandemic. The message being that this is a period that we're going to look back at as a historically significant period in terms of the pandemic. And then once George Floyd was killed, it became clear that this is a period that we might look back on in other ways as well. That the problems are new, but precisely the opposite, that the problems are so long-standing.
Right.
And I think that the tendency sometimes is to not realize how significant the time is. This is a time where there's been a kind of a shift in consciousness or a recognition of the extent and depth of racial injustice that's been unlike any time in our lifetime. I mean, I think that's reflected in the multiracial character of the protests. It's reflected in the sense that, in the fact that a lot of the protests have extended beyond policing to the recognition that we have an entire society that, whether we like it or not, continues to bear the taint of our having been a slave society. And I can't help but think, as a law professor who teaches courses about the 14th Amendment and the history of individual rights and civil rights, that, you know, this brings to mind the civil rights era,
Right.
which was a time when society was restructured at the end of Jim Crow segregation. And then before that, we can go back to the first Reconstruction, which occurred after the end of slavery. And those were both times that they were not simply efforts to, you know, help the freed slaves or help the, you know, disadvantaged racial groups in society. They were actually efforts to reconstruct society. And they were efforts to reconstruct society in ways that would make it work better for everyone. It wasn't until the aftermath of slavery, for example, that the concept of equality took root in our Constitution. It wasn't until the Civil Rights era that we thought that people should be able to immigrate or should be able to find a job or go to school without racial restrictions of any sort. So those were momentous changes that help everyone in society. And the question is, what will we make of this moment? What will we make of this time? And I think here of a friend in another organization that I'm involved in. This is an educational organization that's committed to social justice. And the employees, after COVID struck and after the killing of George Floyd, they were struggling to try to find their way, struggling with their own motivation, trying to figure out what to do. And the leader of this organization said, you know, they were saying, well, maybe we should think about this and that part of what we're doing. And he said, no. First thing you think about is you should think about your children. And you should think about your grandchildren. Think about all of their peers. And you should think about what you want those later generations to say about you. Because this is a time, for good or for ill, when your legacy be made. What you're doing now or not doing now will be recorded by history. It will be judged by history. This either will or will now, unlike any time in our lifetime.
Right.
Not clear when the opportunity will come again. But we do know that there's an opportunity right now to push on the levers of change and to remind ourselves that if the arc of justice is to bend, it's not going to bend on its own.
Right.
It will only bend if we bend it.
Right.
It's a project in which we all have a role to play.
Right. Well, and to that point, a lot of those of us who are people of color, particularly Black folks who are in leadership positions, there's a lot of spotlights on us to help lead and motivate and pull us out of the situation we're in. When I'm like, we've been trying to do this for 400 years.
Yep.
So we will continue to fight. We haven't stopped fighting and stopped leading. It is now up to all of us, as you said, Rick, every single one of us. And where are you? How are you leading in your company, in your organization, in your family through this? Each one of us has got to take that personal responsibility to lead through this. There's a question related to that. In terms of what you said historically, Rick, do you consider this time, as Roland Martin characterized, as the third Reconstruction? I've heard you speak about that. Is this the third Reconstruction of our?
Well, the question of whether we'll have a third Reconstruction is one that is up to us, frankly.
Right.
The Civil Rights era was not destined to happen. Reconstruction was not destined to happen. It only happened because people made it happen. Because there were people who were abolitionists and they knew that slavery was incompatible with the tenets of democracy, and people who knew that Jim Crow and the denial of rights in a systemic way was incompatible with the tenets of democracy. The question is whether we look out at our society now and see anything that we feel deep in our heart is just incompatible with the type of democratic we want to be.
Right, right. I'm going to take a couple of there's a few questions here, and then I want to ask you each about the centers that you all are involved with before we wrap up. But one question back to the body cameras, Jennifer. Read a story recently that body cameras are being used by police for surveillance purposes on protesters. I think many of us have seen that story. And it seems like a nefarious twist on the use of body cameras. So that being the case, would the work that you're doing in terms of analyzing body cameras actually show the difference, right, of it being used in that role versus just the normal course of a police officer's day?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Rick. It's up to us, how we're responding in this situation. And there's nothing sort of inherently sort of negative, right, about body-worn cameras. They can be used as these surveillance tools, but they can also be used as tools of social justice. And so, I feel like we should try to sort of leverage those tools in that way so that they actually help us to, understand like what's leading to escalation, on the streets, that help us to understand what's going on in these encounters. And so, and it's a shame to have all this money in training and all this, spent, this effort spent on these cameras, and to actually never, I shouldn't say never, but like the vast majority of the footage just goes unexamined. And I think that's just wrong. And especially when it holds the answers to what is actually happening on the streets, and especially even in these routine encounters that most people are involved in, right? Or the average person is. So,
I'm really glad that machine learning is going to help play into that. Have you done any training in terms of law enforcement academy, right? Police academies around the country? Have you started, before they even get into the system, right?
I have not myself. I have it was in Spark, the center that I direct. We've worked with POST, so that's the Peace Officer Standards and Training. They set the the standards, right, for how officers are going to be trained across the entire state. So it's over 500 law enforcement agencies here. And so we were involved there with helping them to like giving them information about racial bias. And then also there's a training called procedural justice, that has, lots of police departments across the country have implemented. And that's also a focus on trying to improve or repair, police community relations.
Right. Do you think, and this is Spark, which is the center at Stanford that you're affiliated with. There's a question about the AI-based analysis. Do you think the work that's being done there that you've done in the criminal justice system, could it be applied to the private sector, right? And what we do in the education sector? Do you think, or are different kinds of analysis needed in terms of how teachers work with students, or how, employers train employees? There's another question about, how do we prepare the next generation of leadership, right? So do you think any of the tools or any of the analysis and the work that you're doing in this one area, how does it apply and translate over to other?
So yeah, people are looking at, they're using these techniques in lots of ways. So Dan Jarevsky, he's the chair of the linguistics department at Stanford. So I know he has worked even, with like companies that do, they're sort of automatic sort of, language speech recognition.
Right.
Like Siri and all of that, and looked at, their ability to pick up Black speech versus African-American vernacular English without error. And they find, that there are more errors there than it is with standard speech. We have same issues with some of the face recognition technology where, a lot more errors when it comes to accurately recognizing Black faces than recognizing white faces and so on. So there is, I think that the technology can present a challenge, sometimes in these different areas, but we need to sort of think through how we're going to develop tools that actually improve lives and mitigate bias rather than, tools that could potentially promote bias.
Right.
And so, I know Dan is actually looking at using, machine learning techniques in the education space. And so they're working on projects on that now. So, yeah.
Great. Yeah. So Rick, what about the new Center for Racial Justice at Stanford Law School? What are you looking to accomplish, the goals of that center? It's the first of its kind at our alma mater. And so, which is exciting to hear that Stanford's launched this, but, how do you imagine that this center is going to play a role in addressing the very same problems that we've been talking about?
Rick?
There you are. Are you there?
Okay, I think our connection is we lost a little bit of connection there, but if I heard the question right, I think it was about the recently announced formation of the Racial Justice Center.
Yes, and the goals and addressing some of these issues we're talking about.
Okay, which is based at Stanford Law School, but will serve the entire university and draw from the entire university. And the core impetus, frankly, is that we've it represents the recognition that while the recent events that have heightened the salience of racism are high profile, the problems are longstanding. They actually span across different domains. Criminal justice problems are significant, but so too are inequalities in education and employment, and housing, healthcare, and we wanted to create a center that could draw on the rigorous research, analysis, and evaluation that we can do at the law school and elsewhere at Stanford, and also bring together teams, both within Stanford and with outside partners, to try to address some pressing social problems. Thus far, and this literally is just, we don't even have a website yet. We've just started. We are exploring projects and vetting partners in cooperation with the Stanford Criminal Justice Center, which is longstanding, and also with the Stanford Rock Center for Corporate Governance. And we're looking at vetting some particular projects in the criminal justice area involving policing, but then also in the corporate governance area, speaking to corporations and private entities.
Great. So there's a question that came in when someone registered, actually happened to be one of our board members. What are the practical things that you think this audience can do? So we have philanthropists here, we have folks who work at foundations, people who work at companies in corporate social responsibility and governance. Are there any practical things you think folks should walk away thinking about, particularly right now? You know, what should people be thinking about right now for change right now?
Right. Well,
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, to start with, I mean, it depends on the individual and where they're situated. But I think it's important for us to all realize that, you know, I mean, these crises are really about the health of our democracy. And democracy is not a spectator sport. It's not a time or where we should think that we can sit on the sidelines and just about our lives unconcerned, believe that everything will be okay. Because if we all have that attitude, everything won't be okay. So we need to start from the point of having the motivation to pitch in. And how you pitch in depends on where you're situated. It can involve being involved with your city council, with your school board, with your organization where you work, the organization where you lead. You can engage in many different ways to try to make small changes that in the aggregate can amount to substantial changes that help make democracy more real.
Yeah. Jennifer, anything?
I was going to say, add to that. I mean, I think as foundations and corporations think about how they can best give to the cause, I think it's natural to think about focusing on community groups and advocacy groups, and it's certainly needed for sure. But there's also an opportunity here to support, you know, research, right? To test these new strategies and new ideas, and we want to have evidence-based approaches to addressing social problems, and so that's what we're trying to do at Spark. We're using science to drive change and using science, you know, as a tool for social justice.
Yep. Yeah, let me just add to that our, I think both for Spark and the Racial Justice Center, we don't think of these organizations as alternatives to community-based organizations, because the goal and the method is really to work in partnership with community-based organizations and with other stakeholders so that their desires for reforms are most likely to be successful, because those reforms will be informed by the highest level of research, data analysis, data gathering, all the skills that a place like Stanford can bring to bear on problems.
Right. So we have 2 minutes left, and I want you to any final words. We had a couple more questions that have come in, and we can actually send them to you, and you can, you know, get those questions answered. As you can imagine, there's been quite a bit of interest in this conversation from our network of folks here. There's you know, questions about cannabis prohibition and how's that play. There's questions about how do we push people to really help bend that arc. There was a question about racial profiling, you know, in terms of specific experiences that it's asking Jennifer, but I would say any of us could probably answer that. And then again, this question about, you know, the future leaders. So there's quite a few questions, and we can send them to you, and then we can, you know, get the responses back out to the people who've asked them. But really would love the final, you know, minute, just any parting words that you would have for those of us listening, and what they should, you know, take from this and how they should think about this moment in time.
Yeah, I can just say simply that, you know, as leaders, you have the power to create the conditions that people work under. So create conditions that mitigate bias rather than amplifying it, you know, create conditions that actually reduce racial disparities, you know, rather than magnifying those disparities. And, you know, again, since we're talking about the arc and all of this, I think bending those systems, you know, that you build toward justice, we really need that now. We need people to be sort of mindful of that, mindful of the footprint that they're having out in the world. So thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I second all of that. And I would just add that if people do feel called to this undertaking of moving us, making more real our democracy, they should feel free to reach out to either of us, because we're both actively looking for partners and people to engage in the process with us. For all the resources that we have available at Stanford, we need community partners of all types to bring ideas, other types of resources, relationships. The work can only move forward if we do it as a team. That's right. One of the lessons, frankly, of the civil rights era.
Yes.
As we look back and we focus on the leading figures, but it was really the masses of people who mobilized and said that, you know, they weren't happy with society as it was and they wanted to make it better.
Excellent. Perfect way to end. Perfect way to end. Jennifer and Rick, thank you for being with us today and having this conversation. We could have gone on for another hour easily. It just feels like we just scratched the surface. Maybe we'll do a round 2 in a couple months and see where we are as a country, and maybe have a different kind of conversation maybe then. Would love to have you back and share more about what you're seeing and doing. And to everyone who dialed in, thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us this last hour, and for your interest in this really critical issue and this moment of time in our country. I hope you all continue to engage in the momentum that we're feeling, that I feel, I know, in our country and in our region, and that you each individually commit to work towards change. And if there's anything that the Community Foundation can help you with, please do reach out. And we will be sending a recording out of this after to everybody who's registered, and we will get back to folks who sent in questions. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Jennifer and Rick. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.